I'm tremendously glad to be here. As I mentioned, my wife is 9 months pregnant. We have just an awesome family. We have 3 through adoption, Cameron and Chris and my daughter Zoe, and this is our first biological child on the way after 16 years, and so we're really excited about that. She is due any day now, but I made a deal with my son not to come while I'm here, and so hopefully his first act of life is not rebellion. But people kept telling me that when we adopted our daughter that it would change me, that having a girl would make you different. And I feel the exact same way about her as I do about my other children. Here's a picture of Zoe, my perfect little princess. And I think I do have a picture of the boys. I just don't know where I put it. But here's another picture of my daughter. So, I'm just going to sit these here. But she's just like the other kids. Absolutely no difference between the way I feel about her and the way I feel about my boys. But I am just a proud dad. And I think I'm here tonight primarily for 3 reasons. Number one, because of my love for business. And I'll share a little bit about my background in a moment. Number 2, because of my life as a pastor, just so I can check the room. How many current or former pastors are in the room? And you survived. Praise the Lord. That's good. How many current or former business owners are in the room? A few of you as well. And I think that's a big part of this weekend, is to get us to think in ways that we're not typically challenged to think not only as theologians, to think as pastors, to think from a business perspective. And so hopefully you'll enjoy that throughout the weekend as your challenge to have a more integrated approach to thinking. But I'm here because of those 2 reasons. But I'm also here, I think, in large part because of the lab I get to do all of this in, and that's the city of Detroit, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. In many ways, my talk is from a pastoral perspective, and in particular, a case study on Detroit and how these things play out in a city that hopefully you all are praying for, because I do believe that Detroit in many ways is leading the nation as it pertains to how economic policies that may be well-intentioned but misguided can impact a city. And if it happens in Detroit, don't think that any other city in the nation is insulated from that reality. But let me just tell you a little bit about my background. I am a Michigan State Spartan. So this is a real good weekend for me. As a matter of fact, when I came into the Phoenix airport, some of the coaching staff was actually going through there. So I just kind of wanted to set up camp there and just do my lecture from the airport. But that was pretty cool last night. But my professional training is actually in the area of finance. Before I came into the pastorate, I was in the business world working at Morgan Stanley. Working as an investment advisor for high net worth individuals, corporate organizations, foundations, endowments between Detroit and New York. So I brought a lot of that type of passion into the pastorate. As a matter of fact, when my senior pastor at the time, the founding pastor of our church, who was a client of mine when I was at Morgan Stanley, told me that he was retiring and wanted to know if I was interested in coming into full-time pastoral ministry. I told him not if I had to lay aside my passion for business, and much to my surprise, he encouraged me not to lay that aside, but to bring that. And I found that to be one of the biggest tools and assets for the work of discipleship we're doing in Detroit. But I went on from there to pastor, but then went to Biola out in California. It's good to see Scott Ray and some of the other Biola folks, but went out to Biola and from there went into this whole work of how do we take apologetics, how do we take this whole thought of cultural engagement and transform a city kind of one section of the city at a time. And we've been working on that. Along the way, I got a chance to come on board with Moody Theological Seminary as the campus dean, and nobody really knows what that title represents, including me. I think that more than anything else, what my job is to be an ambassador and to make our private theology more publicly accessible. We have some tremendous scholarship going on at Moody, especially in the area of vocational stewardship. I just want to acknowledge Sergeant Matthews there from Moody in Chicago, and a colleague of mine who helps to provide leadership there for our vocational stewardship programs and initiatives. We're integrating it in many, many different ways, from exegetical studies to class we just put on in global leadership, global perspective and leadership, where 16 of our students had to come up with a business venture, gospel-centered business venture that was not just in writing, but actually came to life. And some of them, about 4 of them, did it internationally. Some of them did it right there in Chicago, but just phenomenal work that they're doing. And so I get the privilege of being able to see how a lot of this stuff is played out in a scholastic way, as well as from the perspective of a practitioner on the ground. So, I talked a little bit about this lab I get to do it in, and it's the beautiful city of Detroit. And I always like to introduce Detroit that way, because I think we have to have an optimistic vision of the places where God has planted us to do ministry. And I do. I see my city as beautiful with marvelous potential. Detroit has enormous challenges, but we also, and let us not forget this, we're also the city that once moved the world by creating automobiles, and we moved the world globally, and we haven't forgotten that. That's still hardwired into our DNA. And so when you come to Detroit and you do ministry, a couple of things you're going to find is, number one, there's a tremendous amount of human capital there. There are a lot of people, there's density there, and that most of the people that are in Detroit have an entrepreneurial spirit. Unfortunately, a lot of them have had that entrepreneurial spirit suppressed and really undermined by, again, a lot of compassion that's gone awry, a lot of public policies that's gone awry. And I don't say that in any partisan way. I say that from the perspective that a lot of times the failure when it comes to public policy is to treat every community as the same. And communities are unique. They're as unique as people are, and we need to respect that fact and understand that the best ideas for transforming cities will come from the people who live in those cities, who bear the Evangel Dei, and we need to encourage that and cultivate that. And so that's really what I've been trying to do with a phenomenal staff in Detroit at Evangel Ministries. And along the way, we have made a ton of mistakes. So let me not just talk about our successes, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but I do want to talk about the mistakes that we made, because for many of us, especially in the African-American community, but I think this is true broader than that, is that we're taught to spell compassion in one way, and that's F-R-E-E. And that's the way we measure everything. So how effective were we in helping the poor? Well, how much free stuff did we give away this year? And so at the end of every year, we can stand up and brag about how many backpacks we gave away, and how much clothes we gave away, and how many bundles of food we gave away, and we pat ourselves on the back. And I remember going to my first Acton Institute, and I got a chance to meet some of the great people in this room and many others. And I remember sitting there feeling like I was going through a born-again experience. And here I am, a guy who has spent the majority of my ministry focused on issues of apologetics and worldview, and thought I pretty much had that down, not realizing that when it comes to our economic worldview and our worldview of government, oftentimes it's inherited. It's not something that we come through based off of in-depth study of Scripture or through strong, sound theological reasoning. We inherit it from the church community that we're around. And I grew up, like most African Americans, in an atmosphere that was very strong on issues of social justice and defending the poor, and unfortunately that embraced a zero-sum approach to wealth creation. And one person got wealthy, that meant another person got poor. And if you really want to succeed in most urban settings, minority urban settings, all you have to do is to find some really prominent people to blame your problems on. And unfortunately, that's really the background that I came from. But after leaving my first Acton Institute conference, I came back and began to ask some really tough questions to my staff, and they were pretty ticked off that I went. And the question that I asked them is, I want us to begin to measure. Isn't that a radical thought? I want us to begin to measure things like transformation from dependency to self-sufficiency, self-reliance. And so one of the areas that we did it in was our feeding program. We work with a local food bank, Gleaners Food Bank in Detroit, phenomenal ministry there. And we feed about 40 families every month. And we've been doing this at the time, about 7 years at the time when I came back with these questions. And so I asked our staff there, how many of the folks that started with us in this feeding program are still getting groceries and food from us every month? And it was upwards of 90% who had started with us were still getting groceries. And I had to ask myself a big question, and that is that really what you're after? Is that going to be the fruit of your ministry? At the end of the day, when people look back on the work that Chris Brooks did in Detroit, will that be my testimony? That I got a whole lot of people that were dependent upon us that are still dependent upon us. Because unfortunately, the legacy of the city that I'm a part of is a legacy of multi-generational dependency, multi-generational poverty. And I can say that, you can't, because I'm a son of Detroit and I love it. But I will tell you that there are some fundamental reasons that I believe I've been able to uncover on why this is the case. But I thank God for the awakening that I went through. And I thank God for people like Wayne Grudem and Father Robert Sirico and Vincent Bacot who introduced me to the theology of Abraham Kuyper, and people like Anthony Bradley. These folks have played an enormous role in my life in helping me to think about how does my faith, how does my Christian worldview play out? And to ask the question, does it really work? Because if we're going to preach it, if we're going to live it, it has to also work. And I can stand here and say to you, a huge affirmative, yes, it works, and we are bearing tremendous fruit in the city of Detroit, and I hope you're excited about that. Let me just say that as I come into a room full of theologians, I just want to remind you of how enormously important, how profoundly important it is, the work that you do, and how important it is that we have a fluid conversation between the halls of academia and the local church. When I came on board as the campus dean at Moody Theological Seminary, that was my marching orders, is to start a conversation between the local church and the seminary, because so often we know there's a great gulf, there's a great divide, and we're working in separate areas, and we're really working with great suspicion about one another. And I'm sure that there are still some suspicions on our staff back at home about me. But the reality is that you all are training our pastors. You're training our pastors, and hopefully we're equipping them to do more than just exegete a passage. Hopefully we're equipping them to do more than just some marital counseling. Because if we're not equipping them to think about vocational stewardship, if we're not training them to think about business and economics, then we're doing them a disservice and an injustice, because after seminary, we're dropping them in an economic world. And we're telling them, hey, we want you to function in this economic world, but we're not going to inform you about any of that. I'm just going to get this microphone out of my way. But we're not going to inform you or train you about any of that. And, you know, I think what this produces, again, what it produced in me, unfortunately, was a lot of pastors who specialize in sentimentality and poverty management, as opposed to empowering people to experience real dignity and virtue and freedom that comes from taking your ideas, bringing them to fruition, and being able to bless not only yourself, but to contribute to your neighbors flourishing, your communities flourishing. This is the type of charge we need to give pastors, and they need to have a time of life where they think about these things deeply. So I just want to once again give a big hand to the Kern Foundation and thank them for the work that they've done in investing in our schools. Can we do that really quickly? So let me just talk about tonight's topic. So I want to talk about the role of the church and urban renewal, in particular about addressing multi-generational poverty. And I say that well aware of the fact that everyone is coming to this conference for different reasons. Some of you are doing great theological scholarship in the area of theology and work. That's important. Some of you are very much concerned about justice and poverty issues. Some of you don't know why you're here, but you enjoyed the meal, and we're glad to have you as well. But the reality is, for me, that the biggest reason why this is important is because I don't believe that you can really disciple a person who can't feed their families. And I don't believe that you can go into an impoverished community and preach a glorious gospel that doesn't bring about holistic transformation. And don't get me wrong, our primary and supreme calling is the evangelization of the world and the discipleship of those who come to Christ. But shouldn't discipleship be holistic? Shouldn't discipleship deal with the areas that matter most? What I see in the Gospels as I look at Jesus' ministry is he dealt with matters that were the biggest matters of their time. He dealt with matters of eternity. He dealt with matters that were at the forefront and the precipice of the generation that he served. And I believe that we need to deal with the biggest matters of our day. And since 2008, and even before that, but in particular since 2008, is there any bigger national narrative? Is there any bigger global narrative than the economic tensions and unrest that are happening in our cities and communities? I mean, there have been such a confluence of factors that have come together that have caused people to be insecure about their jobs, about their future, wondering where is my place in the world and will I be able to have a good quality of life? And the church has to speak to this, and we have to speak to it boldly, and we need to speak to it clearly. And I believe that what pastors need is a really robust, very clear, gospel-centered theology on, again, vocational stewardship, the dignity of work, stewardship of your calling, helping people to understand how their 9 to 5 matters to God and how God has intended for economic flourishing to take place. And we have to give them kind of a blueprint that helps them to understand that. I love this quote by Chuck Colson. I just want to read this to you. It says, "As Christ ministers through us, we will begin to see healing in our land, not through government programs or distant relief funds, but by rolling up our shirt sleeves, taking on the concerns of the needy, and sharing in their suffering. This is the model that Christ gives us." This is the model Christ gives us. He tells us as a church to be solution-oriented, not just to lament, not just to bemoan, not to approach culture from a fear-based perspective that either I retreat or I conquer in his name, but to look at culture as an opportunity to influence in marvelous ways with our gifts and our talents and our abilities, and to be able to get involved in humanity. And I think, again, this is where most relief falls short, and that is that it is faceless relief. It is relationship. It is void of relationship. And so relief and support and any type of initiative that is void of relationship and faceless will ultimately fail. It is the church's responsibility to go into broken communities and to make a difference there. And what happens when the church does not do this? Now I get a chance to talk about Detroit, because I'm a big fan of the church at Detroit. But I'm also very critical of the church of Detroit in a positive way, because I want to see the church grow and fulfill this great calling for which he has called us. God places churches in cities so that cities can be transformed and cities can be saved and won to Christ. He says this to Timothy, "I've left you in Crete so that you might put things in order there." Crete needed Timothy. It needed a local church witness. Detroit needs that. Your cities need that as well. But when the church does not rise to the occasion, or when we just follow the popular drumbeat that's being played by those who have not thought critically from a biblical perspective or framework, then we end up failing the very people that Christ placed us there to be able to bring hope to, renewal, and real transformation. And what happens is when the people hear us preach a gospel that doesn't produce real transformation, it won't be long until they become critical of that gospel. You know, I'm married to a beautiful Ethiopian wife, and we've taken several trips to Africa, and I've gotten a chance to see firsthand this huge religious demographic shift in Ethiopia. And it's predominantly because Islam and Muslims evangelize and influence cultures differently than we do as Christians. We as Christians take more of an individualistic approach, sitting across the table from someone saying, "Hey, can I talk to you about Jesus?" Maybe about a water cooler. But Islam takes a more institutional approach. So they're going to come in and they're going to build a school, and they're going to create jobs, and they're going to influence culture that way. And I don't think it should be an either or proposition. I think that Christians ought to understand that business does much good. And when we come in and influence the institutions and the diverse sectors of our community, then what happens is people see real results. And what I saw in Ethiopia is not that there was not a plethora of churches, and you can critique the church there maybe, but there's a number of churches. There are a number of Christian leaders there. The problem is when you preach a gospel that does not ultimately change the recipient's life, then when another game shows up, then you're vulnerable. And there was a group that came to Detroit. They came and they had a big presentation for pastors, and they kind of touted out this statistic that 40% of African Americans in Detroit are Muslims, and it just factually wasn't true. But what I would say is that upwards of 40% are vulnerable to it. And they're vulnerable to it not because they're not in churches. They're vulnerable to it for the very fact that they are in churches, and they've had enough of the gospel to inoculate them against the real thing. And so what happens in a city when we don't do what we're talking about here, when we don't hold what we're talking about here as being extremely important, and we don't challenge everybody we know and every pastor in particular to live these things out and to propagate the teachings that we see here. I want to talk about Detroit, dependency, and dads. Detroit, dependency, and dads. The city that I'm in is really ground zero for a case study on American public policy that has produced multi-generational dependency. Does anybody in here know what multi-generational dependency looks like? Anybody know what that looks like? When your mother received food stamps, lived off the government, her mother did as well. And now you're third generation, and you've grown up in a home where you have not seen anybody work, right? Now multiply that across your block. So it's not just your home, but about 80% of your block, maybe 70% of your block is seasonal workers at best, transitional work, but no consistent work going on. And multiply that now across your city, right? And imagine what that looks like for youth that's growing up in that type of environment. And again, as churches, we either contribute to that or we reverse that trend. And again, much to my shame, I was a contributor to that for many years until I was introduced to the work of groups like this that we have before us today. In describing Detroit, many of you know that we now are up under the leadership of an emergency financial manager. His name is Kevin Orr, and this is kind of what happens in Michigan and in other cities across the country when a city shows consistent economic stability and is unable to resolve it. An emergency financial manager is put in place after a number of steps and processes have been attempted. But I met with Kevin Orr, who is a PK. He's a pastor's kid, but he's also a cutthroat lawyer, and probably the right man for the job. And that's how he would describe himself publicly, so I'm not talking behind his back. But Kevin Orr described Detroit this way, and this is his description, but I do want to just kind of say I would agree with most of this. Number one, he says, Detroit is a local government that has a great dependency on federal government and a lack of courage to break free. It's a local government that is terrified to tell the federal government, you know what, we'll handle this ourselves. We believe that we have enough resources, innovation, enterprise, philanthropers, entrepreneurs, pastors, we believe we have enough to do this ourselves. There's a great fear. And again, the government dependency, I would say, is oftentimes well-intentioned. You may not agree with that, but I'm going to be charitable. Oftentimes well-intentioned, but sometimes misguided. And I'll just use one example of that, and that is the housing project movement that swept across this country, building places like Cabrini Green in Chicago, and in my own city, the Jeffries projects. These were intended to be housing for low-income families. What they ended up doing is creating places where there was a high concentration of poverty and a high concentration of crime and low opportunities for work and getting out of those projects. And so again, you saw multi-generations of people living in these projects, resulting in drug abuse and a whole lot of crimes, loss of life. And eventually what you're seeing now is that these projects, the testimony of their failure is that they're being destroyed all over the country. They're being knocked down from St. Louis to Chicago to Detroit, and basically a confession that we didn't get that right. Right? And so there's been a lot of policies like this that Detroit has kind of blindly accepted instead of saying to ourselves, is this really good for us? And here's the thing, is this poverty management or is this ultimately economic empowerment that will add to the flourishing of our community? Will this transition a person from poverty and government dependency to ultimate self-reliance? I know I'm speaking in broad, sweeping terms, but I think that you get a feel for what I'm saying here. Secondly, he says that the population of Detroit, which is now, we used to be almost a 2 million person city, we're now 705,000 people, 54.5% roughly are currently unemployed. 54% when you look at the statistic for what it really is. Of that 310 unemployed, about 247,000 say that they aren't even currently looking for a job, right? This is the community that I'm in. 35% of now think about this, 35% of the residents of Detroit receive food stamps. Roughly $500 million a year of food stamps comes into our city, about $500 million a year, 500 million. 15% of our workforce work in the public sector, only 190,000 private sector jobs. Don't get me wrong, thank God for any job. I thank God for the public sector jobs. But just think about it. If you add the number of people that are on dependency and aid with the number of people who work in public sector jobs, something's being created here more than just economic. Now you're starting to get into psychology, and I want to get to that in a moment. Of the 12,000 babies born last year in Detroit, 9,124, or roughly 75.4%, were born in a single-parent home, single-parent moms, predominantly young single-parent moms. So, okay, now let's see how this looks to a young man. Born in a home, there's deep connection to the public sector, to government, local or federal. I don't have a dad at home. I only see a mom. And how is my food being provided? Through government. How's my rent being paid for? Through government. What does government really become? It becomes a dad. Government becomes a father. And I think without getting too much into politics, the reality is that when we come into communities like this and we start doing political campaigns and encouraging people to vote, I think we just totally miss that what you're actually asking people to do, if you're asking them to accept an approach to public policy that lessens the influence of government, you're actually asking them in a very deep way to reject their father. To say, you know what, I'm going to just kind of deny, turn my back on dad, and kind of go a different way. I don't know about you, but I had a great father, and that would be tough for me. So part of how we turn this around is by keeping men in families. And one of the big reasons why men run from families is the fear that I won't be able to provide. And so we start these businesses and help men to say you don't have to run and you don't have to resort to illegal activities. One of those businesses, Higher Ground Landscaping, is just one business in Detroit that one of our partners launched, and really proud of this. The gentleman who started this, former drug addict, got cleaned up, got discipled, started a landscaping service. Began to get contracts around the community for businesses as well as private residential contracts. He has a 17-member staff now. And most of the guys that he is employing are guys who either weren't working or were selling drugs somewhere. right? And now they're able to, with dignity, not looking over their shoulder, go and earn a living. And we did a fundraiser for this business, and we saw a video. One of the staff members said, I used to be so ashamed in the morning when I would leave the house, not knowing whether or not I'd be able to come back to my 3 babies. Now I can tell my children that daddy's going to work, he's going to get a check, and I'm going to come back and be able to provide for them. That's what discipleship is about. And we're praying with him, we're teaching him the scriptures, he's going to church. All those things are played out as well. But this is what I believe Christ has called us to do. And this is why, to me, this work is tremendously important. And I believe there are reasons for optimism in Detroit too. And I think that out of fairness to my fellow pastors back home, I want to make sure that I don't leave you with this dire sense of what's happening in Detroit. So let me tell you some good things that are happening there. According to CareerBuilder.com, Detroit in 2012 was the 4th leading city in producing private sector job growth in 2012 at about 7%. And so cities like San Jose and Houston and Austin were the only 3 that were ahead of us. And what that means is that the auto industry is seeing a resurgence, and we're pretty excited about that. We're really excited about that and seeing folks get jobs. Second thing I'm really optimistic about is, again, this entrepreneurial spirit. And there seems to be this sense that we have enough, again, human capital, enterprise, and innovation for us to move the needle ourselves. And we're getting a lot of philanthropic support for entrepreneurial endeavors and business startups. We're really excited about that. Warren Buffett just came and did a press conference with our governor to launch the 10,000 Small Businesses Initiative, in which several churches are participating and helping to launch 10,000 small businesses over the next 10 years in Detroit. Dan Gilbert, Rock Ventures, launched a program called Wisdom U, which is designed to train those who are planning on launching tech businesses. And part of what we do as a church is we filter and we weed and we do a lot of prospecting to see who can we send to these programs. And one of the young men at our church just went through Wisdom U, and we're really excited that he's launching a tech company. And so this is part of the work of the church and being able to help to make that happen. Again, I mentioned the philanthropic community, Skillman Foundation, Good Neighborhoods Initiative, DeVos Foundation, Kresge Foundation. But let me get it back to the church. I say all those things. I mean, when you see the business community energized and the philanthropic community energized, and all this is great, but you got to have an energized church. And so here's what's exciting, is that there is an unprecedented movement of unity among the local churches in Detroit, across denomination and tradition, and it's really, really exciting. I get to sit on the executive team of a movement called EACH, which stands for Everyone a Chance to Hear. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go to eachtoday.com. 550 churches have come together, and to think really big about what community transformation looks like and how we can make it happen. Last year, we built homes. We were able to renovate 48 blocks last year. This year, we're going to target several public schools that we as churches, we represent about 200,000 congregants. And we're trying our best to make it happen there in the city. But this happens when the church begins to get a vision that God wants to use us in innovative ways. So how do we get churches to break the cycle of poverty, and what do we need to teach pastors about how we can think deeper about vocational stewardship and faith work and economics? I love what John Perkins said. John Perkins said, many of the problems in the ghetto that I was seeing were really the unsolved problems of the South. The incident, he's referring to a time when he was abused by a police officer, triggered a growing conviction that God wanted me to go back to Mississippi, to identify with my people there, to help them break out of the cycle of despair, not by encouraging them to leave, but by showing them new life right where they were. This is John Perkins from his book, Let Justice Roll Down. Now, here's what's beautiful about what John Perkins is saying, is that our gospel message can't be that Christ can transform you, just not in this city. He can really, revolutionize your life, just not in this neighborhood. We have to be able to convince people, and I hope you're persuaded of this, I know I am, that the gospel is a supernatural message that brings supernatural transformation across every context, time zone, culture, I believe that, and I believe that it's true for Detroit as well. You know, growing up, my parents' generation, if you were raised in Detroit in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s, and you're African American, you defined success by moving out. That I've arrived when I get out of this city. And one of the toughest things to do is to get someone from that generation to move back into the city. You know, but part of what my conviction is as a pastor is that I am in my city, my beautiful, beloved city, not by force, but by choice. Because I believe the history of the Christian church is that we've run into broken cities when they were in their greatest moments of despair, not running from them. And so what John Perkins hits on is really where the rubber meets the road. Are we just going to think philosophically about this and just have great conferences and discussions, or are we going to be real practitioners of this? And if we're going to be real practitioners, then we need to find places, labs, if you will, where this stuff is desperately needed. And so part of what I want to encourage you to do throughout this weekend is to pray not just about the what, not just about the how, but to pray about the where. Because I believe that's important to God. Where you apply all that we're going to be learning this weekend is very much important to God. Everything turns around, and I'm totally convinced of this because I've seen it firsthand. It starts with the gospel. All turnaround starts with the gospel. And I want to refer to Ephesians 4:28. Ephesians 4:28 says, and many of you know this already, it says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Now, as you begin to dissect and dive deep into that passage, what it does is create a new motivation for prosperity. The motivation for prosperity is not just personal gain. The motivation for prosperity is let me produce so that I can have something to distribute. And I think this is what brings compassion into capitalism. This is what makes what we're talking about gospel-centered, is when the end goal is not just personal prosperity. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad in that at all. But the end goal is to ultimately be able to contribute to the flourishing of my neighbor, my community, my city, my nation, and my generation. And I believe, again, the only way this happens is if we teach three big principles: wealth creation, wealth management, wealth distribution. And we have to continue to teach it over and over again. There's not a year that goes by in my local church where I don't teach on these themes for an extended period of time, 4, 6, 8 weeks. It's so important that everyone hears about wealth creation. And really the Old Testament shows us and demonstrates for us wealth creation in a God-honoring way. And then wealth management, and we see that so much in the Gospels, the stewardship of wealth. And then wealth distribution, the end goal of the Great Commission is to be able to, and I'm defining wealth broadly, not just in monetary terms, but the sharing of wisdom and ingenuity, and again, innovation, and being able to bring value to a person's life. And I want to talk about wealth creation. What is wealth creation? Wealth creation is the freedom and protection to turn ideas and energy into goods and resources. People need to have a sense of freedom and a sense of protection. Now, this is where the church really finds her justice mission, is because when we see that those freedoms to take energy and to turn it into goods and services, and the protection that corresponds with that allows a person to flourish, when we see those things being infringed upon, it is our responsibility to stand up and say, no, no, no. No, you can't infringe upon a person's ability to think freely and to take their ideas and to turn it into something of value and to enter into markets of exchange where that can be a blessing to many other people. And you can't infringe upon the protection of those ideas. When you begin to do that, you have the reality of a depressed, not only economy, but a depressed humanity. Now, one of the ways that on a local church level that we really drive home wealth creation is not just through sermons, though I love to preach, and I love to preach long sermons too. But we don't just do it sermonically, but we also have built a financial intelligence team, a local team of people who bring certain expertise to the table, because hopefully if you preach right, people should be inspired to do. And when it comes time to doing, they're going to need to have a team of individuals who have legal expertise and accounting expertise and business solution expertise and marketing and all these other skills, technology, to be able to bring this thing to fruition. And I would say to every pastor, and you want to encourage pastors, as much as you can, build this through the farm system. 2 ways to build a baseball team: through the farm system and through free agency. Now, as much as you can, you want to cultivate from within. And you do that by finding people who already have these callings to business and to think this way about how God has created economies to work with discipleship in an integrated and seamless way. And you want to invest in them and encourage them and disciple them in a gospel-centered way. But you also have to look beyond, at times, beyond just your 4 walls, and you got to bring in other resources. But it's so important that you have that team there for people to have a sense of incubation, that I can have an idea, come to my local church, and have that reproduce and actually come alive right before my eyes. And it's important as we think about wealth creation that we get away from thinking that emergency assistance produces wealth. And this is one of the things that I had to come to the conclusion of. It's not that emergency assistance isn't bad. If a tornado rips through your town, you need someone to bring water and clothes and toothbrushes and some housing. Those things are good. But let's not fool ourselves. They don't create wealth. 3 things create wealth: education, employment, and entrepreneurship. Those are the 3 big E's that we have to focus in on. If we're going to create wealth, we have to make sure that we are focused in on removing every barrier we can to folks, especially those in poverty, from getting jobs, good jobs, getting great education, and being able to launch a business. And I would say, from a pastoral perspective, my church embraces and gets excited about what we celebrate. And so it became really important for me as a pastor to make sure we celebrated those who are graduating from high school. In a city that has about a 23% graduation rate, our church graduates 98% of our kids. 98% of our kids. We incentivize them, though, too. We don't mind giving them scholarships, and we don't just give them scholarships, but we double that scholarship if you go to a Christian college or Moody. Right? It's kind of selfish, but right? But we incentivize them to do that. And I don't know how much that factors in. Obviously now, I think we could probably take away some of the scholarship and they would still just high perform, because we created a high performance culture. One of the things we thought about was the Asian community. Asian community, if you study how they perform academically, by and large, they outperform no matter what setting you put them in, right? They're going to outperform. And they do it by and large by creating and I'm speaking in general terms, but by creating a subculture. So we just thought, why don't we create a subculture within our local church of high-performing kids who graduated and went on to college. So that's the language we talk about from the time that they can talk, right? Getting people jobs, we celebrate that. We have job fairs at our church. Entrepreneurship, we're giving away small business grants to get people going. And we're also praying for business owners periodically throughout the year, bringing them up on stage and just praying for them, and salespeople, and encouraging that work. Whatever you see celebrated in the church, people will respond to. Just 2 more points, and then you can fall asleep. I already have. Two more points real quickly. Wealth distribution. And let me just say this. Professor Robert Kennedy, as you know, wrote the book, The Good That Business Does. Reformation theologians. He really takes us back to the way reformers thought about work, and this is something that we've tried to do as well at our local church. Reformation theologians also acknowledge the legitimacy of commerce and its vital role in providing goods for the community and in increasing the nation's wealth. The honest merchant, in their view, carried on God's work by distributing fairly the resources that the Creator had scattered unevenly about the earth. Commerce, as a result, was an instrument of justice, and a vehicle for improving the fellowship of the human race. And this is what, again, I believe we should teach. Wealth management. What good is wealth if you create it and lose it? So part of what we do is we teach multi-generational thinking, And so that creates a need for insurance products so that you can protect your wealth, legal documents like wills and trusts, so that you can pass that on, and to get people thinking charitably. Can you imagine how revolutionary it is for a person who grows up in a city with so much dependency to start talking about a charitable remainder trust? Where does that fit into the equation? Well, now you're thinking multi-generationally, and when you begin to dream like that and use that type of terminology and to show people this can happen with you, they begin to pass that down, and we're seeing that happen. And again, in the subculture, don't get me wrong, I mean, we're still filing bankruptcy as a city. There's still a ton of work to do. That's why God called me when I was young, because He knew I needed a lot of time. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're finding that it's happening in small ways in our fellowship and in our neighborhood that we service there. Finally, wealth distribution. Seeing wealth as an instrument of justice. Having a passion to be able to use your resources to meet the needs of other people and to invest. Now, again, I'm an investor, trained as a stockbroker, and so I don't believe in just giving people money. I don't believe in just giving people money. I do believe in investing in the best projects and people for the advancement of the gospel. And I don't think we should ever be ashamed of that. I don't think we should apologize about that. I don't think we should just give people money just out of guilty consciences. But even when it comes to church planning and missions work, I want to see fruitfulness. I want to see how many lives are you touching? Are you actually getting work done? We just, as a congregation, gave, I don't know, maybe like $7,000 or $8,000 to World Vision for the Philippines. And it's great anytime I can have my congregation say, hey, we're just going to raise some money and give it to the Philippines. How many of you black folks have been to the Philippines? Like 3. But we do that, right, to get them thinking outside of their normal context. But we gave it to World Vision because World Vision, after we did our study, had the best results. They were actually getting the resources to the people who needed it better than the other organizations we looked at. So we're not apologetic at all about investing your giving, investing your charity. And I think that if we take the approach of investors, we'll see more fruitfulness and people will be more encouraged because we'll see more success. So I just want to end with this and just say that as we approach training pastors, it's important for you to understand that you are tremendous influencers in their lives. Much of my theology was shaped by my profs at Michigan Theological Seminary, which is the name of our school before we merged with Moody and Biola. Sitting in those classrooms during that season of my life really helped me to think critically about my application and living out of the gospel. That's the influence that you as theologians have. And it's important for you to understand that and for you to champion and communicate to those pastors the amount of influence they have to change the cities they live in. God loves cities, and He places churches in cities so that these cities can be saved and transformed. And that's the work that we're doing here at Kern. So I'm glad to be with you tonight. Thank you.